So the title of my presentation today is the title of the book which I published with Koen, which is Adaptive Reuse of the Built Heritage Concepts and Cases of an Emerging Discipline. During the introduction, Sergio also mentioned, oh, I have to see how I can, move the presentation. So Sergio mentioned also that I'm a member of the research group TRACE, which is the research group in Hasselt working on adaptive reuse, which is also closely linked to the master that we have. And we have a website if you're interested in what we are working on. Apart from the things that I will address today, you can find on the website information also about the different projects that we are working on, the postdoctoral research and the doctoral students. And you can also find some more information on the master project. This is a poster of the international master. So we have an architectural and interior program at our university, which is taught in Dutch, but we also have an international master, which is taught in English, which focuses specifically on training on how to intervene in existing buildings, or more broadly in an existing historical context. So not only buildings, but also sites which have a very strong historic layer. And we make a poster every year. And the slide which you see now is the most recent poster. And it's a scan of a sketchbook by one of the former students, Matthew Moskal. And it shows his analysis and some ideas for interventions in the Museum of Art and History in Brussels. So as I said, we have this year 18 students in our program, several of them from Turkey or studying before in Turkey, but many of our students are also from much further away. So in the lecture that I give today, I would like to give you a brief introduction in some of the concepts related to heritage and adaptive reuse that are also discussed more in depth in our master program. So first, what is adaptive reuse? So I would describe adaptive reuse as a process of transforming existing buildings or sites in more general terms for a new or a continued use. And examples of that can move from the regeneration of industrial sites into a museum for contemporary art, for example, the ruins of a church, which might become a university library, or abandoned urban infrastructure, such as a railway track or an industrial site, that might become a park. But adaptive reuse is not only a way to classify buildings, but it can also be a way to look at the built environment, a sort of an attitude, or to say, which holds the middle between, on the one hand, a tabula rasa, in which buildings are designed from a plain sheet, or on the other hand, as an alternative for conservation, that actually wants to freeze the existing condition in a historical condition, not up to date. Adaptive reuse instead then presents a way of looking at the existing, questioning which elements can be reused and which, on the other hand, can be transformed. Adaptive reuse is also not a new phenomenon. Throughout history, buildings have been adapted to changing needs or tastes without many questions or problems. And the motivation behind this was mainly practical, because it was just easier to reuse what was close to the site than to bring new materials to the site. And it was also more economical, it was cheaper. And a great example of this is the historical center of Split in Croatia, which emerged out of the remains of the ancient palace of the Emperor Diocletian, which was constructed in the 3rd century after Christ. The emperor lived there only a few years. After that, the site was abandoned and it slowly transformed into a ruin. But several centuries later, when the neighboring town Salona was invaded, its citizens actually fled Salona and took residence in the ruins of the palace of Diocletian. And they adapted the ruins to all sorts of functions which they needed to shape their town. Housing, but also religious buildings, streets, and public squares. And the ancient palace became really interwoven in the urban fabric. It became a sort of ambiguous interior-exterior structure. And the historic center of Split is actually preserved not despite of its reuse, but exactly because of its reuse. And it's today preserved as a World Heritage Site, exactly because of the richness of the historic layers that are there in the city. But an actual theory on conservation of buildings of the past emerged in Europe only in the 19th century. So the example of the Palace of Diocletian, but many other examples of reuse that are older actually emerged out of because of vernacular interventions or because of a particular interest of a certain building owner or architect. But the real theory of adaptive reuse, seeing also heritage preservation and conservation of existing buildings as a responsibility of the nation, this is something, a modern concept which emerged in the 19th century. At that time, there were two very different streets of thought, and maybe you have discussed this also in your previous courses. On the one hand, there was the restoration movement by mainly Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. On the other hand, there was the anti-restoration or the conservation movement, which was led by John Ruskin and William Morris in England. And they appreciated in historic buildings the traces of decay. They found this very beautiful, inspiring, intriguing, and they therefore argued to preserve a building as found and limit interventions to maintenance or very minimal hands-on repair without a clear architectural signature. So if we think about John Ruskin, for example, William Morris in particular, and Viollet-le-Duc, they are both figures who are important in the field of conservation as an architecture. So up to the 19th century, architecture and conservation were actually very closely linked disciplines. The style in which was built were mainly also neo-styles, neoclassical, neo-Gothic styles. And this changed in the 20th century, where and especially after in the aftermath of the Second and the First World War, where the question was raised how to deal with the cities that had been destroyed by the war. On the one hand, the conservation movement aimed to reconstruct the cities as they had been before the war. On the other hand, the field of architecture, modern architecture, really aspired to create new cities that completely break with tradition that would stand for a new modern way of life. And the two disciplines, conservation and architecture, became very different, actually, working with a different frame of reference that seemed difficult to bring together. But in the second half of the 20th century, we see that architects become more and more interested in working with historic buildings and see it as an important aspect of their oeuvre. And examples of architects that established an oeuvre based on building adaptation or Carlo Scarpa in Italy, Lina Bobardi in Brazil, or more recently Herzog and de Miro in Switzerland, but operating also all over an office all over the world. On the other hand, because the increasing number of protected buildings, because our notion of what is heritage has been extended very broadly, and a lot of buildings are nowadays protected because they tell us something about the past of our culture, it becomes also impossible to just preserve buildings without giving them a new function, without integrating them in a contemporary life, so to say. And therefore also in the field of conservation, this idea of management of change and adapting buildings to current needs becomes more and more important and interesting. And this is a figure that I often used to explain how adaptive reuse has become a sort of discipline in its own right. Although it's something that is as old as a building practice itself, it has become a more emancipated discipline with its own body of theory from the 1960s onward, overlapping between, on the one hand, architecture, on the other hand, conservation, but there are also many other disciplines that feed the practice and the theory, such as interior architecture, urban planning, engineering, but also sociology, archaeology, etc. And then I would say that although in practice, we can say that renovation of existing buildings in many countries exceeds new constructions, both in size as well as in budget, still adaptive reuse as an academic field with a distinct body of theory is still a bit undeveloped. So there are definitely interesting books published, theoretical books published on the topic the last years, but at the time when I started to investigate this topic about 10 years ago, I really felt that the different sources that were, or the different books that were written really weren't building on the knowledge that was generated, and that there was a sort of lack of a sort of mapping of the discipline. So that's why with my colleague Koenraad van Kleef, who was the chair of our research group, we published a book together in which we, on the one hand, aimed to map the field, doing an extensive literature study, but on the other hand, also describe different concepts and strategies for intervention that we observed in practice, but which, to our feeling, were not described yet in adaptive reuse theory. And in the lecture, which I will give today, I would like to illustrate some of these strategies that we refer to through mainly by elaborating on examples rather than theory. To start, actually, there were different ways to look at, different ways to look at an existing building or the existing fabric in general. So while conservation looks at buildings as monuments that should be preserved and handed over to a future generation as authentic as possible, the concept of adaptive reuse invites to look at the building as a palimpsest. And the metaphor of the palimpsest was introduced in 1976 by Rodolfo Machado in his seminal text, All Buildings as Palimpsests. What Machado does in his text is to compare the process of remodeling with the process of writing and rewriting of existing text. And he introduces this notion of the palimpsest to better understand how to read existing buildings. A palimpsest, you can see an example on the image on this slide, is a reused piece of parchment. And the top layer of this parchment is scraped off and a new text is written on top of the same parchment. And after some time, what happens is that the original text actually reappears and that different stories can be read from one and the same document. And Machado argues that a similar process is also applied in architectural adaptation, as elements and materials from a building are scrapped off and new layers are adding depending on changing needs or tastes. The result is actually that when we observe a building carefully, an historic building, its history, its different stories can be read from its fabric. And this metaphor can not only be applied to the physical fabric, but also intangible characteristics of a building, its narratives, and the way that new stories can be added to an existing site. It's a metaphor, actually, so this concept of the palimpsest, which is also used by many authors who elaborate on adaptive reuse nowadays. And I would like to share with you just one quote from Machado's text, which summarizes what, to my feeling, is really the purpose of adaptive reuse. So I quote that: in the process of remodeling, however, the past takes on a greater significance because it itself is the material to be altered and reshaped. The past provides the already written, marked canvas on which each successive remodeling finds its own place. Thus, the past becomes a package of sense, of built-up meaning to be accepted, maintained, transformed, or suppressed, refused, end of quote. And in what follows, I will introduce some strategies for intervention. These strategies do not only change the outlook and the function of the building, but are also means to bring back, alter the meaning of the building, what is exactly what Machado is also referring to here. A first strategy is what Koen and I called immolation, which is a term which we borrowed from art theory. It's a strategy that starts from the notion that copying can be a valuable strategy for adaptive reuse. We felt that for a long time, the general approach to intervening in historic buildings was by creating a strong contrast between the old and the new. Just to show you some examples, the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid by Jean Nouvel, or the Military Museum in Dresden by Daniel Liebeskind. And immediately on even this one picture, you can clearly distinguish between what is the old building and what is the new intervention. This contrast was a way for architects to leave their mark on a building and to, in a certain way, also claim authorship for the projects which they developed. But also in the field of conservation, a clear contrast between the old and the new was put forward. Maybe some of the students are already familiar with conservation theory and international charters, I don't know, but this these are actually charters that serves as guiding principles on how to deal with heritage conservation. The Venice Charter from 1946, but still probably up to present, the most famous charter and a sort of dogmatic text on how to deal with or how to execute restorations or how to deal with historic buildings, states that any extra work which is indispensable, extra work, it means everything which is beyond restoration, must be distinct from the architectural composition and must bear a contemporary stamp. And this contemporary stamp was usually seen as contrast. The same goes for the Bura Charter, which states also that new work should be readily identifiable as such. So the projects, for example, by Liebeskind and Jean Nouvel show how this is frequently interpreted. In the field of architecture, there seems to be a taboo on copying of existing works, while in many other art forms, the practice of copying of older masters is very common and is considered equally valuable than the creation of an original work of art, so to say. On your left, you see the very famous Renaissance painting by Velázquez, Las Meninas. And on the right, you see a copy which Picasso made of this work in his own particular style. And he made this painting not early in his career, when as a way of studying composition or painting techniques, but he painted this in 1957 when he was 76 years old and a famous artist. And in that sense, we can conclude that Picasso actually made this work not to learn from Velázquez, but rather to measure himself against this great master. Moreover, he did not just make one painting, but he made a whole series after this one work by Velázquez, so which seemed for him then a really sustained source of inspiration. So the richness of this painting was really celebrated, so to say, by Picasso. Scott also makes a comparison with the act of translation in the field of poetry. And he describes that when translating a poem, the translator needs to move sentences, change wordings, etc., in order to translate the spirit and the meaning of the poem, rather to make a very literal translation of it. And hence he says the act of translation requires at least as much inspiration and talent as the writing of a new poem. In a similar way, Scott argues the translation of a building from one epoch into another requires equal skill than the design of a new building. So back to the act of copying then. So to better understand different ways of copying, my colleague Koenraad, who's an art historian, and we looked at Renaissance art theory that had defined different terms, or that had terminology established to describe different ways of copying, different relations between the copy and the model. And emulatio is a term that refers to a form of copying that does not try to reproduce an existing work of art as accurate as possible, but that instead aims to improve the work. And this is also what Peter Paul Rubens' intention was when he copied Caravaggio's Entombment of Christ. Rubens made this copy just 1 decade after Caravaggio has painted this one. He had seen the painting during one of his travels to Italy, and he had heard and read critiques that were formulated about Caravaggio's work. And in Rubens' version, he slightly changes the composition of the painting by adding and removing figures in the background, changing the color of their clothing. He also gave them a more natural and emotional expression, which Rubens was quite famous for. But he changes very little to the main theme of the painting, which is the almost physical presence of the dying Christ in the center of the painting. And he even emphasizes this by draping the white sheet over the shoulder of Thomas of Arimathea in the front to give this figure of the Christ an even more central presence in the painting. So which of the paintings is the better one? I leave it up to you, but the intention of Caravaggio was definitely to show himself a better artist than Caravaggio. So his intention was to improve. We recognized actually this attitude of copying, improving while copying, or copying plus improving, also in contemporary projects of adaptive reuse, and in particular in the oeuvre of Carousel St. John, a British office, which uses this process of copying very frequently in their practice. For this example, the Tate Britain, they were asked to develop a master plan for the museum, and they found that the circulation in the building had to be improved. And also they needed to activate the basement to make more space for different sorts of activities, exhibition, but also other social activities of the museum. And usually when an architect needs to introduce a staircase in a protected monument, he or she would opt to do that in a part of the building which is less valuable, a bit hidden often, because it's a rather strong intervention, rather invasive. But Carousel St. John actually chose to insert a staircase in the most prominent space of the museum, the central rotunda, and make the new spiral staircase connecting the ground floor with the basement the new focal point in the space. The design language which they use is strongly inspired by the neoclassical style of the building. So here the floor and the balustrades are new, which you can see, but which is not that obvious, and all the rest was existing. Another example is the Noise Museum in Berlin by David Chipperfield and Julian Harrop as a restoration architect. The building was heavily destroyed during the Second World War, and this drawing by Chipperfield shows the concept of the winning project. So the room was consolidated where possible, but where parts were missing, they were recreated in a slightly abstracted form. One of the most prominent architectural interventions in the museum is a central staircase. On the left, you see the staircase. On the right, you see the situation as a ruin. And then a new staircase was designed that follows the shape of the original staircase, but in a contemporary material, concrete, with also a more massive form, or more massive shape, actually. So the original design, again, is copied, but in a contemporary way. So another strategy that I would like to discuss today is facadism. Facadism is the practice of retaining the front or exterior walls of a building while the interior is demolished and reconstructed in a contemporary form. In the 1960s, this became really widespread as a strategy applied to historic buildings in the context of urban regeneration. It was often seen as a reaction against modernist principles of urban development, which included extensive demolition of historic urban areas, which destroyed the familiar townscape. And facadism was hence regarded as a method of upgrading urban infrastructure, while simultaneously also preserving the historical appearance. However, facadism is also understood in a different way, especially in architectural theory, for example, referring to the opposite practice, where you would preserve a building but refront it with a new facade to match it to its surroundings better, or to give the building a more contemporary outlook. Or even a broader definition, in more general terms, you could also say that facadism is an architectural practice that is centrally focused on the facade as an architectural element, largely independent from the rest of the building. Here you can see some of the most extreme examples of facadism. And although facadism is widely practiced in nearly all parts of the world, I assume that in Turkey, I've been to Istanbul and I've definitely seen some examples of facadism in Istanbul, but I assume that also in the region you're working on, this is a frequently occurring practice. This is hardly addressed in theories, and the limited accounts that exist in the fields of architecture, planning, and conservation are actually far from positive. So here I have just collected a few quotes. In an Decomposition charter, it explicitly states that removal of inner structures, maintaining only the facades, does not fit conservation criteria according to Decomposition. It can be described as a compromise solution, which is still rather friendly appreciation, but also brutal expression, failure of town planning, architecture reduced to an image, or my favorite, adaptive reuse gone wild. So despite this overarching aversion of facadism in theory, several renowned renovation projects are in fact examples of facadism, as they just retain the building envelope and introduce new interior structure and layout. The Tate Modern, a project by Hector and Dummerow, which is widely seen as one of the celebrated examples of adaptive reuse. In fact, you can see on the right where the skept of the original building is not much more than the facade. Or a project which is a bit older by Giancarlo Di Carlo, Il Magisterio in Urbino, which is also like Scarpa. Giancarlo Di Carlo is seen also as one of the main architects who introduced working with the existing and adaptive reuse in the field of architecture in the second part of the 20th century. One of the iconic projects which he made for the university in Urbino is also, if you look at that plans, basically an example of facadism. So in what follows, I would like actually to show you several examples of different forms of facadism, which I believe are interesting and inspirational. So I will sometimes also draw a parallel with prominent examples from a historical architectural canon, because it's not only in this post-war renovation projects that we find facadism, but even in probably prominent examples that you've for sure discussed in architectural history classes could also be named as facadism. A first form of facadism is the most traditional interpretation, I would say, just the retention of the facade. Hector and Dummerow applied this strategy in several projects. So they were the architects of the Tate Modern in London, but they also applied it for the Kaiser Forum in Madrid, where they even went a step further, making it even more explicit that this is just a preservation of the facade. The building is a former power station, and it was transformed into a cultural center, but it was located at one of the most prominent cultural districts in Madrid, just in front of the Prado Museum. The industrial building, at the time it was built already, didn't really fit its surrounding. It was built there out of necessity, but the outlook of the building was strange in relation to its urban context. So nevertheless, it was protected, but in Spain you have different levels of protection. So it was the lowest level of protections, which meant that it didn't have to be restored fully, but that it couldn't be demolished either. In the retained facade, they bricked up all the existing windows in a similar color, but leaving the marks of this intervention clearly visible. And they made new openings wherever needed, depending to the new plan of the interior. And then the volume on top is in corten steel, which in coloring somehow fits with the brick facade, but is clearly contemporary. The second type of facadism, I would call it refronting, is replacing of the existing facade with a more contemporary one while retaining the building behind it. And it's a recurring practice in architectural history. And a very famous, powerful example is Alberti's Renaissance facade of the Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which is in architectural history classes definitely very frequently discussed as an important Renaissance building. So the new facade actually combines classical temple forms, but it also respects the existing rose window of the Gothic church, which is behind this. And as you can see on the right image, the back facade of the church was kept in its Gothic appearance. So the fact that the building was refronted was not hidden or concealed, but was really seen as something positive. Maison Edouard François was the office who did the transformation into a hotel, and they wanted to give this whole block a more unified outlook, and also give it a sort of iconic, unified, but at the same time also iconic outlook. So to make the hotel, give it really a sort of clearly contemporary stamp. So the most important exterior intervention was the replacement of the curtain wall facade of the 1970s building, so the modern building, because that's strongly contrasted with the adjacent facade. What they did was to take the protected Haussmann facade as a model, very literally, because they scanned the whole, made a 3D scan of the whole historic facade, and they derived from that scan slabs, just copies, which or an abstracted form, both in material and in relief, of the Haussmann facade. And they used that as a cladding for the new facade of the 1970s building. The position of the windows of the model facade were visible in the relief, but they're not used as windows. Instead, as Herzog and de Meuron also did in the Kijkstervorm, they just made openings according to the new plan of the museum. Hotel, sorry. So if we look at the meaning of the facade in architectural theory, we see that it is often described as a means to communicate a message about the function and the meaning of the building to a wider public. But besides changing the meaning of the building, a facade can also serve a more functional role. And Andrea Palazzio's intervention in the Palazzo della Ragione in Vicenza, 16th century projects, served not only an aesthetic purpose, of course, it had a clearly aesthetic purpose, but besides that, also a functional one. And he organized in that newly created semi-interior, semi-exterior area, also the vertical circulation, so that you could move around and within the building in a different way. Also here again, the intervention, the outer facade is clearly Palladian in style, neoclassical, but the Gothic windows, for example, from the older facade are not adapted or hidden. So the confrontation between the neoclassical and the Gothic is shown in this project. And a contemporary example that works with adaptation of the facade as a basic renovation strategy to also functionally upgrade the building is Tour Bois le Prêtre, a project by Lacaton Vasal. In a study which was commissioned by the French government, this office, Lacaton Vasal, together with Frédéric Bruot, they developed a somehow generic strategy on how to renovate post-war social housing projects, because many of the buildings, housing blocks that were constructed in the second half of the 20th century need to be updated to contemporary housing needs, and especially the energy efficiency had to be improved. And they developed a generic strategy of replacing the facade of this building, extending, but at the same time also enlarging the apartments by doing so. And they applied this rather general strategy in several projects, among which the Tour Bois le Prêtre near Paris. So the 16-story high tower was constructed in the 1960s as a concrete load-bearing structure with a curtain wall facade. The original facade had been renovated then in the 1990s to by adding insulation panels and double glazing, but still this didn't comply with updated housing requirements of today. So what the architects did was to strip the existing facade and add an independent load-bearing structure as an extension of existing floors on all the different sides of the building. So what they actually did was enlarging the apartments with a winter garden and a balcony. So the new glass facade allowed for more daylight to come into the interior, but it also gave a view towards the exterior. So for the people living there, had a better view on the surroundings. So, Lacaton and Vasal stated that their primary goal was, of course, to improve the functional and technical performance of the building. But the aesthetic impact is also quite significantly giving actually the building a completely new appearance. So where before the tower really looked like a social housing block, like there has been hundreds built in the outskirts of Paris, they now look more like luxury apartments with a great view over the city. So it's not only functional, but also changes to a certain extent the meaning and connotation that this building has. And then I would like to conclude with a new research topic that I'm currently exploring actually, which is the reuse of ruins and the process of ruination as a strategy to intervene in existing fabric. What is a ruin actually? It's sometimes difficult to define. When is a building a ruin? When it is just still a building or an abandoned structure? And I like very much this definition, which is given by Ginsberg. A ruin can become a ruin usually through a process. After being abandoned, it takes some time, then nature is taking over. There is a slow process of natural degradation of the building, but it can sometimes also be a destructive act. For example, it can be a man caused by man, for example, the result of an armed conflict, but it can also be the result of a natural disaster, which is also quite suddenly. And so there are different types of ruins, but what they have in common is so that the original unity, as Ginsberg describes, is lost, but it's not necessarily only a loss. It can also, there are new characteristics that appear. And that is actually what's interesting. What then is this new characteristic that we find so intriguing about ruins and how to work with that throughout the process of reuse and adaptation. What these characteristics actually are also becomes clear in the engraving by Piranesi of Hadrian's villa at the outskirts of Rome, where you can clearly see how the fabric is degraded, how boundaries between interior and exterior are becoming blurred. So former interior spaces are now used as exterior. How nature is taking over the place. Vegetation is growing on top of the building, inside the building. But also, if you take a closer look at the image, you see how the space, which doesn't have a formal use anymore, is appropriated by people who are walking around, using the place as a shelter. You see a beggar there. It's a place to meet outside of the public realm. So it even gets a sort of functional role, which is different than the function that the building had when it was still in its original unity, we could say. And at first sight, these characteristics that define the room, that make it so attractive to many people, are rather contradictory to the idea of adaptive reuse, because if you would reuse a ruin for a new function, most of these qualities would get lost. And we notice, however, that there are examples at hand of cases that use this process of ruination in a clever way to generate an interesting strategy for adaptive reuse. And a first example, it's also a case that was on the first poster of our master program, and that has inspired not only me, but also other people in our research group for many years, actually, is this church in Lavapiés in Madrid, and was kept as a ruin in the city for many, many years. So on the one hand, it is a ruin because of a destructive act, but the ruin then, because it was not consolidated or protected, then degraded even further as a slow process. In the concept of transformation, the architects, Lina Zasoro and Sanchez, they consolidated the ruin as they found it. And they closed the building and created a usable space by, for example, creating a new facade, which you can see here on this image. And to create this new facade, to construct this facade, they used different sizes of bricks with very strong texture to evoke also the fragmented and very textured quality of the bricks of the ruin, what they had become throughout the years. They also integrated some stone details that were found at the site as a sort of spolia. And in the remains of the ruin, they preserved the ruin as much as found as possible. So no window frames are visible from the outside. The cupola is not reconstructed. A new ceiling is created actually, but at a lower position, so that you experience the ruin still as a ruin. In the interior also, the ruin is largely left untouched. A new vault was created, but with a softer curve than the original vault of the Baroque church, and doing so, to my feeling at least, makes the space less monumental than if they would have followed the curve of the Baroque vaulting. And this filters the light that falls into the building in a way that also is similar to the light. The light falls into the crumbling ruin, because also the way the light comes into a ruin is very different than how it is within a building which is solid. And this is also something that they wanted to work with, I believe. Another way to reuse a building in the form of a ruin is by transforming it to a folie in the landscape. So a folie is a type of construction that was made for gardens, English landscape gardens mainly, in the 18th century, as a visual element, as a small place to retreat in the garden without having a real function. And often these folies were also constructed as artificial ruins, sometimes really copying a ruin that was existing, for example, in Rome. Or it could be sometimes a fragment of a ruin that was decomposed and brought to another site and there reconstructed, or it could be a reinvented ruin. And in a similar way, building and structures that are obsolescent can be kept in a ruinous state as an orientation point, a witness of the past, And while its surrounding is transformed into a park, or more naturally overgrown by nature. This example, the Landschapspark Duisburg Noord by Peter Latz, is a very large site, a very large industrial site that after the industries were closed, transformed into a park for recreation. And the former industrial structures and buildings are preserved. Some of them got a new function, but many just as a sort of folie. You can walk around them, you can sometimes go up, use some of the spaces as a viewing platform, but they do not have a formal function. And it's quite intriguing. And the oeuvre of Peter Latz as a landscape architect he's a landscape architect, but often working with remains of former industrial landscapes or other types of landscapes. And it's very intriguing, actually, the work that he's doing. So definitely worth taking a look at it. Some of the structures in these parks are used for recreation, for example, as a diving pit or a climbing wall or a playground for children, or just as a sort of orientation point alongside the bicycle paths which run through the park. Again, an example by Lakato and Vasal, Palais de Tokyo. This is actually a project where the building is transformed into a ruin in the process of transformation. So the building they were given was not a room, but they made a ruin out of it. So when the architects were asked to transform Palais de Tokyo into a center for contemporary art, they were challenged with some issues. So first of all, the very static and monumental outlook of the building, which did not really fit the message that the art center wanted to perform. Parts of the interior had also been stripped back with the intention to create a cinema, which was a quite invasive intervention there, but it never happened. And thirdly, also they had a very limited budget to realize the project. So what they did was to continue this process of ruination in the interior, which had started when creating the cinema. And they also created a more ambiguous relation between the inside and the outside by doing so. Here you see the newly inserted staircase, which also has the appearance of a temporary intervention rather than a carefully designed feature. And the result is not just a project that could be realized with a small budget, but also an art center that doesn't look like an institutional space, but that instead looks more like an informal space, almost an urban squat, as we could say. And then the last form of ruination that I would like to discuss is probably the most extreme one. It's namely the decomposition of existing buildings and the reuse of its materials in new construction. A Belgian example is a decomposition of the interiors of the Generale Bank, an office building. And the decomposition was done by Rotor. It's a Belgian office who specialized in the reuse of materials and material flows. And this post-war office building was actually decided to be demolished, to be replaced by a new office building at the same site. But some of the interiors were really designed by famous interior designers of the 60s and 70s. And with the demolition, these interiors would get lost. Therefore, they decided to dismantle them and reuse the materials in new projects. On the left, you can see one of the original spaces in the office building, designed by Jules Wabbe, who was like one of the famous modernist designers. And on the right, you see a pharmacy in which the ceiling panels of the Generale Bank, which were custom designed by Jules Wabbe, or integrated. In this case, I had a discussion with the designer who integrated the panels, and she explained really that she bought the last panels from this stockpile, which was not enough to cover the entire ceiling. The reason why she chose these panels above newly panels that she could order from a catalog was that she just couldn't find materials with the same qualities for a reasonable price. So only the custom-made elements by Wobbe actually was what she could find to use. Because they were not enough, she had to change the plan of the interior to combine it with other ceiling elements. And she explained that actually starting from these reused materials gave her the concept for the whole interior. So all the other materials were actually adapted to these panels that she reused. So the question we could ask is this an ecological way to do architecture and interior, to construct interior? Because of course the whole construction industry, both for buildings but also for interiors, is an industry that causes a lot of waste. This is also an argument why adaptive reuse, it's not only a heritage reasons that we want to do, but also because it's just also more ecological than new constructions. But at the same time, Rotor, the office who did the decomposition, also argued that it's a good way to preserve the heritage of Joe Wobbe. I have to say that if you look at the different projects where these panels are integrated, is this really preserving the heritage of Joe Wobbe? I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely interesting to look into this practice and to consider how to work with materials that were previously used in other buildings, and how this can be a way to also hand over memory and meanings from one building to another. So with these questions, I would like to conclude my part of the talk here. I also include some links where you can find further reading if you're interested in some of the examples to read a bit more in depth about it. But I would love to hear also your comments and thoughts on the different cases that were discussed. So